Welcome, dear dreamer. And tonight, we journey into the high places of Japan, where mountains rise like ancient guardians and the air grows thin enough for the divine to breathe through it. These peaks are not just stone and snow. They are realms where the kami dwell, where clouds gather like veils, and where those who climb feel the world quietly fall away beneath their feet. Here, in these towering sanctuaries of wind and prayer, every ridge carries a story older than empires, and every path feels shaped by footsteps that came seeking purity, rebirth, or quiet communion. The land whispers in the rustle of cedar forests, the spirit stirs in the hush of snowfields, and the mountains themselves stand as bridges between the human world and the unseen. Before we wander deeper, tell me directly, what are the small things you do at night that help you fall asleep faster? Share them with me. I would love to read every single one. And if these calm journeys into myth and memory bring you peace, feel free to subscribe so we can continue exploring these ancient paths together. Long before carved shrines rose beneath cedar canopies, long before written prayer or painted mandalas shaped the language of faith, the people of Japan looked to the mountains and felt the presence of something vast and breathing. These towering forms, wrapped in mist and silence, seemed too ancient for human hands to claim. They were boundaries between worlds, places where the sky folded itself into the land, where storms gathered with intention, and where dawn unfurled like a quiet blessing. It was here, on these slopes untouched by early settlement, that the first seeds of reverence took root. The earliest inhabitants of the islands lived in close intimacy with nature, relying on forests for shelter, rivers for sustenance, and the mountains for direction. But mountains were not merely geography. They were presences. They shaped weather, guided travelers, and watched over villages from distances both protective and immense. When sunlight struck their ridges, the people saw divine radiance. When fog coiled around their peaks, they sensed hidden spirits. And when thunder rolled across their slopes, it echoed with the authority of unseen kami. Central to early Japanese belief was the idea that the natural world was alive with spirit. Every stone, every stream, every gust of wind carried a spark of the sacred. Yet the mountains stood apart, holding a deeper, more concentrated presence, as though the world's quiet breath collected there and took form. They were liminal spaces, thresholds between what could be touched and what could only be felt. Those who climbed them did not do so casually. Each ascent was a dialogue with the unseen. In these early centuries, before codified religion shaped strict borders of belief, the mountains simply were the altars. People approached them with offerings made of rice, salt, or branches from sacred trees. Hunters paused at their base to whisper thanks. Travelers bowed before entering their valleys. The people understood instinctively that the mountains watched, listened, and carried memory across generations. As communities settled and grew, the mountains became woven into the fabric of daily life. Farmers looked to their peaks for signs of seasonal change. Priests formed early rituals of purification, traveling into mountain forests to commune with the spirits said to dwell there. Children heard stories from elders, tales of towering kami who lived among the crags, of guardian spirits who protected villages, and of deities who descended from peaks in moments of great transformation. These stories were not told to frighten. They were spoken with reverence, shaping a worldview in which the mountains were parents, protectors, and silent teachers. In their heights, people sensed order. In their storms, they sensed warning. In their snows, they sensed renewal. Every season carried a different face of the mountain's spirit, and people learned to read these changes with the same care they showed toward the rhythms of their own lives. Centuries passed, but the bond between people and mountains did not weaken, it deepened. Certain peaks became known as places where the boundary between the human world and the divine world thinned to a breath. These locations, called Shinpi no Basho, mysterious, numinous places, drew pilgrims from distant provinces. Some traveled in search of blessings, others for purification, and some simply to feel the quiet power of the high places. In villages near sacred mountains, dawn rituals began with offerings placed toward the rising peaks. In the evenings, smoke from hearths curled upward in soft trails, rising as if in answer to a call. The mountains were not distant gods. They were neighbors, towering guardians who shaped the daily rhythm of life. And though their spirits could not be seen with the eyes, they were felt in the shifting of winds and the tremble of leaves. Shinto, in its earliest form, did not separate the sacred from the natural. It recognized the divine in the very breath of the world. Mountains were revered not because they promised power or miracles, but because they embodied presence, a quiet, steady presence that held the world together with invisible threads. In the murmur of rivers fed by mountain springs, people felt the kami's voice. In the cold clarity of mountain-fed lakes, they saw the reflection of purity. Over time, certain mountains emerged as especially sacred. Peaks such as Fuji, Tate, and Haku called to pilgrims with irresistible pull. Each held its own character, one serene and symmetrical, another rugged and storm-shaped, another draped in forests that whispered with age. But all were united by the belief that the heights were closer to the realm of the gods. Climbing them was not simply an act of endurance, it was an act of transformation. These mountains became spiritual landmarks long before they became physical destinations. People spoke of them with awe, describing how snow lingered on their crowns like celestial garments, how sunlight struck their slopes in golden ribbons, how clouds seemed to bow as they drifted past. To walk near these mountains was to feel a shift in the heart, as though the air itself invited one to breathe more deeply, more carefully. Shrines began to rise near the mountain bases, simple at first, no more than wooden structures sheltered by branches. Priests tended to them, offering prayers for safe passage, good harvests, or protection from storms. Over generations, these shrines grew into complexes of vibrant vermilion gates, stone paths, and sacred lanterns, each echoing the presence of the mountain behind it. Yet even as shrines formed around them, the mountains remained wild. The peaks resisted domestication. The forests cloaked their slopes in shifting layers of green and shadow. Animals moved through their paths with the same ancient patterns. And the people understood. The mountain was not something to conquer or claim. It was something to enter with humility. Pilgrims often spent days preparing for ascent. They bathed in river water, cleansed their hands with salt, and offered prayers at shrines near the base. The climb itself was seen as a journey inward. Each step carried symbolic weight, rising from the ordinary world, entering the realm of spirit, shedding impurities through breath and motion. The higher one climbed, the more the world below seemed to fall away, leaving only wind, stone, and silence. And in that silence, many felt the presence of something greater, not loud, not overwhelming, but subtle, like a pulse beneath the surface of the world. The belief that mountains housed kami shaped not only spiritual practice, but the very imagination of Japan. Artists painted them with sweeping brushstrokes, capturing their silhouettes in ink and gold. Poets wrote of them in verses that compared peaks to sleeping dragons or quiet guardians. Even warriors, hardened by conflict, sought purification in mountain retreats, believing that the heights cleansed the burdens of battle. As centuries turned, Japan's understanding of the sacred landscape evolved, shaped by waves of cultural and spiritual influence. Yet the mountains remained constant. Buddhism merged with Shinto practices, giving rise to traditions in which monks retreated to the high forests to seek enlightenment. Ascetic practitioners, known as yamabushi, walked mountain trails in quests for transformation, blending ancient nature worship with rigorous discipline. But through every shift of belief, one truth remained unchanged. The mountains were alive with kami. They breathed with the seasons, whispered through the cedars, and revealed themselves in moments of soft stillness. People continued to bow toward their peaks, continued to climb their slopes, continued to believe that the mountain spirit watched over the land. And even now, in an age of trains and towers, when neon lights scatter across city nights and technology moves faster than thought, the mountains remain untouched in their spirit. Travelers still arrive at their bases with a kind of instinctive reverence. Hikers feel the quiet shift when the wind changes tone. Pilgrims kneel before Torii gates that open towards shadowed slopes, for the spiritual landscape of Japan is not confined to the past. It breathes in the mountains still, in their vastness, their silence, their unbroken presence. And in every footstep taken on their ancient paths, the boundary between earth and divine grows thin once more. As centuries flowed like quiet rivers through the history of the archipelago, the mountains continue to shape the soul of Japan, not through force or monument, but through presence. Even as cities grew and roads spread across valleys that once lay untouched, the high places remained guardians of a slower rhythm. They watched over the world from distances that invited contemplation, rising beyond the reach of politics, commerce, and change. And every generation found its way back to them, as though instinctively remembering the ancient truth. That meaning deepens when the earth climbs closer to the sky. Villages nestled near sacred peaks formed their lives according to the mountain's breath. When clouds gathered around a summit, people read the sky as a message. When snow lingered longer than expected, they believed the mountain was cleansing itself. When winds rushed down its slopes with sudden fierceness, they spoke of kami stirring in the heights. These were not superstitions, they were acts of relationship. For the mountain was not a distant symbol, but a living neighbor whose moods shaped the cycles of human life. Season after season, rituals unfolded at the foot of these peaks, small gestures performed with sincerity rather than spectacle. Families placed offerings of rice or sake on stones at the forest edge, thanking the mountain for safe harvests. Elders traced their fingers along weathered bark, whispering prayers for protection. Children, taught from infancy to respect the land, bowed before entering mountain trails, even if they ventured only a few steps into the trees. The mountains responded not in words, but in atmosphere. The soft dimming of light beneath a cedar canopy, the hush of moss-covered earth, the faint coolness that drifted down from higher altitudes. These sensations became part of the spiritual vocabulary of the land. To step into a mountain forest was to step into a place where everything slowed. Voices lowered, footsteps softened, and even breath found a quieter pace. As the centuries turned, Japan entered eras marked by shifting power and foreign influence. Yet no matter how belief systems expanded and intertwined, the reverence for mountains remained unshaken. When Buddhism entered the islands and shaped the architecture of temples, monks looked to the mountains as natural places for meditation. They built temples along steep paths, where worshippers ascended stone steps that seemed to lead directly into the clouds. They believed the high places supported spiritual clarity, where the mind could unclasp itself from worldly concerns and rest in the stillness of pure awareness. Shinto priests, likewise, continued to maintain ancient mountain shrines, passing down rituals that preserved the dialogue between human and kami. In their teachings, the mountains were not simply holy, they were manifestations of the divine. Some peaks were said to house kami in their very stone. Others served as pillars connecting the visible world with the unseen. And so the mountains became both destination and deity, both path and purpose. Travelers from distant regions embarked on pilgrimages that wound through forests, across ridges, and along river valleys born from mountain springs. These journeys were long and often strenuous, but pilgrims welcomed the hardship. Every step carried symbolic weight, representing a shedding of the ordinary and an approach toward clarity. Pilgrims often walked in silence, each person attuning their thoughts to the breath of the land. When they reached vistas, where the entire valley unfolded below like a painted scroll, many bowed not out of obligation, but out of gratitude for the moment the mountain had offered them. The mountains shaped not only spiritual practice, but cultural imagination. In poetry, they became metaphors for endurance, solitude, and purity. In art, their silhouettes stretched across silk screens with quiet majesty. In music, their presence was evoked through flutes that echoed the wind's gentle wandering. Even in warfare, commanders looked to mountains for omens, believing their moods foretold shifts in collective fortune. One of the most enduring beliefs was that mountains held the power to purify. Water flowing from sacred peaks was used in ritual cleansing, as it was believed to carry the mountain's own clarity. Bathing in cold mountain streams became a practice of renewal, a symbolic washing away of burdens. Even the air itself, crisp, thin, touched by height, was considered sacred, capable of bringing stillness to the heart. Stories spread of those who encountered the kami themselves in the high forests. Some spoke of luminous forms glimpsed at dusk, others of strange but calming sounds carried on the wind. More often, the encounters were subtle, an overwhelming peace that settled unexpectedly, or the sensation of being observed with benevolence. These experiences wove themselves into folklore, reinforcing the belief that the mountains were living realms of spirit. During the medieval period, mountain worship gained new depth as ascetics retreated into remote ranges to train their bodies and minds. These practitioners sought to experience the land without filters, to feel the raw pulse of nature in storms, in waterfalls, in nights spent beneath the open sky. They believed that the mountains tested them, stripped away illusion, and revealed the essence buried beneath layers of human desire. Their stories, shared in fragmented poems and whispered teachings, further solidified the mountains' identity as places of awakening. Even as Japan entered more structured eras of governance, the mountains never lost their sacred quietness. When roads improved and more people traveled for trade or pilgrimage, the peaks remained guardians of calm. Travelers would pause at certain places to make offerings, acknowledging the mountain's presence before continuing their journey. Small wayside shrines marked paths through the foothills, inviting passers-by to stop, breathe, and rediscover their connection to the land. Time flowed on. Villages grew. Cities flourished. The world shifted again and again through eras of change, yet the mountains endured with patient constancy. They watched as wars erupted and faded, as new philosophies emerged, as the nation reshaped itself. And through it all, they remained silent teachers, offering their lessons through wind, height, and stillness. When modernity swept across Japan with trains, electricity, and rapid expansion, some feared the mountains would lose their sacred place in the cultural landscape. But instead, the opposite happened. People began to seek them even more. Urban life, bustling and swift, gave the mountains new purpose. They became sanctuaries for those longing for quiet, spaces where the ancient rhythms could still be felt beneath the noise of contemporary life. Hikers climbed their trails not only for physical challenge, but for an intangible sense of return. Pilgrims continued to walk centuries-old routes, finding comfort in paths worn smooth by generations. Photographers captured mountain mists drifting through trees, sharing with the world moments that felt almost otherworldly. And even those who never stepped onto the trails looked to the mountains from afar, finding solace in the way they anchored the horizon. In the present day, Japan continues to honor its sacred landscapes through festivals, conservation efforts, and sustainable tourism. Mountain shrines remain places of worship, their steps polished by countless pilgrims. Ceremonies celebrate the changing seasons, marking the mountain's shifting moods with songs and offerings. Guides teach visitors about the spiritual history etched into the stones. And in classrooms, children learn how the mountains have shaped the heart of their culture for thousands of years. Yet for all the layers of ritual, story, and memory, the true essence of Japan's spiritual landscape remains simple. The mountains are alive. Their presence is felt not in grand displays, but in the quiet ways they shape the world, in the stillness they grant, in the humility they inspire, in the sense of belonging they awaken within those who approach with open hearts. And so, even now, when humanity moves faster than ever, the mountains wait with patient grace. They rise into the sky with the same ancient dignity, offering to all who gaze upon them a reminder that the sacred is not hidden. It is simply higher, quieter, and eternally present. Long before Mount Fuji became a symbol recognized across the world, before artists traced its perfect silhouette onto scrolls, and before pilgrims turned their faces upward in devotion, the mountain existed as a quiet miracle of the land. It rose from the earth with a symmetry so serene, it seemed shaped by intention rather than nature. Clouds gathered around its peak as though paying respect, and sunlight touched its slopes with a purity that stirred awe even in those who lived far from its base. It was, from the earliest days, a mountain that did not simply stand, it called. The people who first gazed upon Fuji did not see a geological wonder. They saw a divine form, a presence radiant in its stillness. To them, the mountain was more than land. It was a realm where purity dwelled, where the mortal world brushed against the heavens. Its snow-capped summit, gleaming even in distant seasons, became a symbol of spiritual ascent, a visual echo of the desire to rise above impurity and seek clarity within. In ancient mythology, Fuji was linked to cycles of creation and destruction. Its volcanic nature hinted at the powers that shaped the archipelago: fire beneath the earth, pressure in the stone, the restless dreams of the kami who molded the land. Tales told of deities slumbering beneath its slopes, of spirits who stirred the fires when the world needed renewal. And though eruptions brought fear, they also brought reverence, for the people understood that even destruction was part of the mountain's sacred breath. At Fuji's base, early communities lived with a unique mixture of awe and familiarity. They tended fields nourished by volcanic soil, built shrines along forested trails, and cast their prayers toward the mountain each dawn. As smoke curled from household hearths, it rose toward the towering peak, blending human devotion with the mountain's own quiet exhalations. Life was lived in the shadow of greatness, not oppressive, but protective, as though Fuji watched over those who honored it. For centuries, few dared ascend the mountain. Its height seemed reserved for the divine alone. The peak was a sanctuary untouched, a place where human presence felt unworthy. Yet even from afar, the mountain shaped belief. Its image appeared in poetry, where writers described Fuji as a pillar holding up the sky, or as a celestial mirror reflecting the heart's deepest longings. Painters captured its form in flowing ink strokes, emphasizing the balance and elegance found in its ridges. Children grew up hearing their elders say that Fuji was not merely seen, it was felt. As time moved forward, the desire to climb Fuji transformed from forbidden thought into sacred calling. Pilgrims believed that ascending its slopes brought purification, enabling them to shed the impurities of daily life and emerge renewed. Climbing the mountain became an act of spiritual courage, a journey that mirrored the path of inner awakening. It was said that at the summit, where air grows thin and the world below shrinks into soft haze, the soul could glimpse truths hidden from the ordinary mind. Pilgrimage routes emerged slowly, worn into the land by generations of footsteps. Some were narrow and winding, weaving through forests dense with cedar trees. Others climbed directly through volcanic rock, harsh and silent, where wind roared like a guardian spirit. Each path carried its own character, but all shared the same intent: to guide the pilgrim toward the highest point of purity. The climb was rarely easy. Weather around Fuji shifted unpredictably, as though testing the resolve of those who sought its summit. Mists could descend without warning, cloaking the slopes in uncertainty. Sudden gusts of wind challenged balance. Yet these hardships were embraced, not feared. Pilgrims believed the mountain's challenges were part of its divine nature, that endurance itself was a form of prayer. Along the lower trails, small shrines marked places of rest. Pilgrims paused to offer rice or to bow before carved stones, thanking the mountain for safe passage so far. These shrines, simple in structure, carried profound energy. They were points of connection where the earth's breath seemed to rise, where silence resonated with gentle power. As climbers rose higher, vegetation thinned. Trees grew sparse, replaced by patches of hardy grasses and stones worn smooth by centuries of wind. The air cooled, carrying hints of the summit's cold purity. Pilgrims often spoke of a shift that occurred somewhere between forest and rock, the feeling that the mountain was no longer simply steep, but sacred. Breath became prayer. Footsteps became offerings. By the time they reached the upper slopes, the world below had transformed into a distant dream. Valleys stretched like painted landscapes. Rivers shimmered like threads of silver. Clouds drifted beneath them in soft waves. To stand upon these heights was to see the land with the perspective of a kami, to feel the quiet power that had shaped belief for generations. At the summit, the experience softened into profound stillness. Pilgrims described a sensation of emptiness, not void, but purity. The wind carried a tone unlike anything heard below, as though it whispered the mountain's ancient memory. Some climbers knelt in prayer. Others simply gazed into the horizon, tears forming as they confronted the quiet immensity before them. Fuji did not speak in words, yet it communicated something unmistakable, a reminder that the sacred is vast, patient, and deeply present. Ceremonies often took place at the summit, where priests performed rituals of purification and renewal. They offered prayers to the sun as it rose, thanked the spirits dwelling in the crater, and invoked blessings for those who had made the journey. When dawn touched the world with a pale gold, illuminating the mountain's crown, the moment felt like an awakening shared by all who stood upon the peak. Fuji's summit became known as a threshold, the closest place to heaven accessible to human feet, and those who reached it returned changed. Villages welcomed them as though they carried fragments of divine light, their presence bringing reassurance and clarity to the community. As the centuries progressed, Fuji's role expanded beyond spiritual ascent. Artists immortalized it with increasing precision. Poets compared its slopes to the arcs of dreams. Even travelers who visited for practical reasons found themselves unexpectedly touched by its presence. The mountain's silhouette became a symbol of Japan itself, appearing on scrolls, textiles, screens, and eventually photographs. Yet despite this widespread fame, Fuji never lost its spirit. It remained pure, serene, and quietly immense. Climbers still felt the shift in atmosphere as they ascended. Pilgrims still approached the mountain with humility. Shinto priests still performed cleansing rituals at its base, honoring the spirits believed to dwell within the crater and the forests surrounding it. Fuji's purity became part of its legend, a purity not tied to physical cleanliness, but to spiritual stillness. Even in modern times, when roads and technology eased access, those who climbed Fuji found themselves entering a realm where distractions faded, the body tired, the breath steadied, the mind slowed. And in that slowing, the mountain's presence became clear, for Fuji is not only climbed, it is listened to, it is felt, it is remembered. Its slopes hold centuries of devotion, its summit carries the prayers of countless ancestors. Its silhouette rests in the hearts of those who have gazed upon it, reminding them that purity is not perfection. It is the gentle alignment of spirit, land, and silence. As the ages unfolded and Japan's cultural identity grew more intricate, Mount Fuji continued to rise at the center of the nation's spiritual imagination. Unchanging, unmoved, untouched by the rush of human eras passing below. Though countless hands sought to capture its shape in ink or carve its image into wood, the mountain remained more than any one depiction. Its presence existed not only in the physical world, but also in the dreams, prayers, and quiet contemplations of those who lived in its shadow. For many, Fuji represented the axis of purity, a beacon standing between the earthly realm and the realm of the divine. Even when seen from great distances, its perfect symmetry seemed to beckon, its peak often veiled in a soft veil of cloud, as if holding its sacredness in gentle reserve. Travelers approaching from the Takeda Road would pause upon their journeys just to witness the shape of Fuji rising above the landscape, its presence offering comfort to the weary and inspiration to the hopeful. The mountain became a compass in more ways than one. Pilgrims used its silhouette to navigate their path. Artists used it to anchor compositions. Everyday people used it to cling to the idea that something constant still existed in the world. When cities changed, governments rose and fell, and seasons of hardship arrived, Fuji stood gently above it all, reminding the people that purity could still be found, silent, steady, waiting. During the Edo period, Fuji worship blossomed into a deeply structured practice. Groups known as Fujiko formed across the country, gathering commoners, farmers, merchants, and artisans into communities devoted to honoring the mountain. Many members could not travel to the actual peak, yet they climbed miniature Fuji mounds. Built in towns throughout Japan, carefully crafted replicas formed from sacred soil and stones transported from the real mountain. Ascending these mounds symbolized the same spiritual journey as climbing the true Fuji, allowing people of all backgrounds to experience purification. These Fujiko groups often traveled together, embarking on pilgrimages that could span weeks or months. Wearing white garments symbolizing spiritual rebirth, they chanted prayers, shared water from sacred springs, and carried talismans inscribed with symbols of the mountain's protective power. For them, the climb was not a test of strength, but a practice of unity. Each step taken with others, each breath shared in collective rhythm, each pause filled with gratitude for the mountain guiding their hearts upward. As pilgrims climbed, they encountered a landscape that shifted with altitude, each zone carrying its own spirit. In the lower forests, where cedars rose with timeless dignity, the air smelled of resin and earth. Midway up, volcanic gravel crunched beneath their sandals, and the wind sang through fissures in the stone like a distant flute. Higher still, the world thinned into a place of raw elements, rock, wind, cold, and the sky opened wide, as if inviting the climber into its embrace. Ritual stations dotted the ascent, each offering a symbolic moment of transition. At some stations, pilgrims washed their hands with cold spring water, letting the liquid run through their fingers as a sign of cleansing. At others, they knelt in the dust before stone markers, whispering prayers for safe passage. And at the final gate before the summit, a hush often fell, not commanded, not choreographed, but born naturally from the recognition that the next steps carried one into the highest shrine of the mountain. Once upon the peak, pilgrims circled the crater, treating it as a sacred boundary between the human realm and the world where Kami might dwell. Here the air tasted different, thin, crisp, edged with the purity that defined Fuji's spirit. Dawn ceremonies held at the summit were among the most profound experiences for those who made the climb. As the horizon slowly brightened, revealing soft hues of rose and gold, the world seemed to pause. Then, as the first edge of the sun rose like a glowing ember, climbers felt an overwhelming wash of emotion, as though witnessing the birth of the day from a place meant only for the gods. This moment, known as Goreiko, was described by many as a blessing. The sun's emergence over the sea of clouds felt like a divine greeting, a reminder that purity was not merely an ideal, it was a lived moment, found in the stillness between breaths, in the warmth of light touching cold skin, in the sense of standing upon the threshold of heaven. For many, this experience remained etched in memory long after they returned to daily life. Fuji's volcanic nature added further depth to its spiritual identity. While eruptions brought fear, they also shaped the belief that Fuji held transformative power. The mountain was not static. It breathed fire beneath its calm exterior, embodying the duality of creation and destruction. Lava flows carved new paths, reshaped forests, and altered the contours of the land. In the wake of these changes, communities rebuilt, forests regrew, and spiritual understanding deepened. Fuji's fire became a symbol of renewal, the idea that from hardship emerged new clarity, new purity. As Buddhism continued to spread throughout Japan, Fuji's sacredness intertwined with Buddhist teachings. Monks climbed the mountain seeking enlightenment, viewing the ascent as symbolic of the journey toward awakening. Some spent weeks meditating in caves along its slopes. Others performed rituals at the crater's edge, chanting sutras into the wind as though offering their vows to the mountain itself. Fuji became both a Shinto deity and a Buddhist pathway, a rare convergence of traditions woven by centuries of devotion. Artists, too, found endless inspiration in Fuji's form. The mountain appeared in countless woodblock prints, each capturing a different facet of its personality. Hokusai's iconic series, 36 Views of Mount Fuji, portrayed the mountain not as an isolated subject, but as part of everyday life, floating above fishermen, towering beyond bridges, standing still as storms gathered around it. These images cemented Fuji not only as a sacred peak, but as a symbol of resilience and beauty embedded within the landscape of the nation. And yet, despite the mountain's widespread fame, those who approached it felt the same ancient awe. Whether a pilgrim in white robes, an artist seeking inspiration, or a traveler drawn by curiosity, each found themselves speaking more softly as they stepped onto its trails. Something within the mountain quieted the spirit, inviting reflection without command. Even those unaccustomed to spiritual practice felt a subtle shift, an instinctual desire to walk more gently, breathe more slowly, and listen more deeply. When the modern era brought paved roads, mountain huts, and designated climbing seasons, some feared the sacredness of the mountain would fade. But Fuji proved that purity does not vanish simply because more footsteps find their way to its slopes. Instead, the mountain absorbed these new rhythms with its timeless calm. Pilgrims continued to climb at dawn. Families visited to introduce their children to the reverence held by generations. Climbers paused at shrines along the route, bowing before stepping onto higher paths. And the mountain remained exactly as it had always been, quiet, immense, and profoundly accepting. In recent decades, Fuji's recognition as a UNESCO World Heritage Site elevated its cultural and spiritual status further. Global visitors now walk the trails once known only to pilgrims and locals. They listen to guides explain the mountain's myths, bow at sacred stones, and gaze at the crater in shared silence. Yet even with this wider audience, Fuji maintains its essence. The mountain welcomes all who approach sincerely, regardless of background or belief, offering the same stillness, the same purity, the same patient presence. For Fuji's true sacredness lies not in exclusivity, but in openness. It is a mountain that invites, a mountain that listens, a mountain that stands as a bridge between sky and earth, between human and divine, between the present moment and the ancient world beneath it. Those who descend after touching the summit often speak of feeling lighter, not because the climb is over, but because the mountain has given them something quiet and immeasurable. Some describe it as clarity, others as peace, others simply as a memory that will accompany them for the rest of their lives. For Mount Fuji is not only Japan's highest peak, it is Japan's highest prayer, a towering expression of purity, serenity, and the stillness that dwells at the heart of all sacred things. Long before maps traced the contours of the Japanese archipelago, and before shrines rose along ancient trade routes, 3 mountains stood as luminous pillars of belief. They were not simply peaks, they were expressions of the land's breath, guardians of purity, strength, and unseen presence. Fuji in the east, Haku in the west, and Tate in the north formed a quiet triad, a triangle of spiritual gravity that shaped the imagination of centuries. These peaks did not compete for awe, they completed one another, each carrying a different shade of the divine. In the earliest stories, travelers spoke of these mountains as if they were voices in a choir, distinct yet united, each singing its own hymn to the sky. Fuji offered radiant purity, its perfect slopes rising like a prayer cast in snow and fire. Haku breathed with the calm of ancient whiteness, a mountain wrapped in clouds thick as dreams. And Tate, fierce and steadfast, watched over the northern horizon like a sentinel carved from blue stone and wind. For the people who lived among them, these three mountains formed a sacred constellation, a geography of spirit rather than distance. Fuji, Haku, and Tate were called Sanrizen, the three sacred mountains, because each embodied a facet of the world's spiritual order. Fuji's purity lifted the heart. Haku's serenity stilled the mind. Tate's strength fortified the spirit. Together, they formed a balanced trinity woven into the land's deepest memory. Pilgrims who could not climb one journeyed to another, believing that each offered a unique path toward inner refinement. Some dreamed of visiting all three in their lifetime, a pilgrimage known as a quiet coronation of the soul. In ancient times, before roads smoothed the journey, people walked for days through forests and along rivers to reach these peaks. Their steps carried purpose, not haste. Each mountain required a particular kind of devotion. Fuji demanded perseverance, its steep slopes tested resolve. Haku demanded patience, its frequent mists concealed paths, inviting trust rather than sight. Tate demanded endurance. Its rugged terrain and sharp ridges challenged those who sought its summit. To climb these mountains was not merely to ascend, it was to be shaped. The bond between the Sanrizen and the people was not forged through monumental temples or dramatic revelations. It formed slowly, through generations of quiet encounters. A shepherd looking up at Haku's glowing crown at dusk, a fisherman watching clouds roll around Fuji like folded silk, a traveler resting in Tate's shadow, feeling the wind whisper through the pines. In these ordinary moments, the mountain's sacredness revealed itself, not as a spectacle, but as a presence. Fuji, of course, often received the most renowned praise. Its silhouette became the face of Japan's spirit, rising with symmetrical grace that inspired poets, priests, and wanderers alike. Yet Haku and Tate held power of their own. Mount Haku, known as White Mountain, gleamed beneath heavy blankets of snow, its ridges reflecting moonlight with a serenity that stilled even the busiest mind. People believed its snows were blessings, tears of purity shared by the mountain's resident deity. Tate, on the other hand, embodied strength and fortitude. It rose sharply, its cliffs shaped by harsh winds and ancient glaciers, its presence unyielding and fierce. Those who approached Tate often felt a different kind of awe, a recognition of resilience. In the spiritual landscape of Japan, these mountains became gateways to realms beyond understanding. Ascetics seeking enlightenment climbed their slopes as part of rigorous training. They believed that each peak revealed a different facet of truth. Fuji showed the light of purity. Haku revealed the stillness of the heart. Tate offered the clarity of strength. The ascetics often traveled between the three mountains over years, their journeys marked by solitude, contemplation, and devotion to the unseen. Temples and shrines gradually grew around their bases. On Fuji's trail stood wooden gates weathered by centuries of wind. Along Haku's approach, green moss gathered on stones where pilgrims had knelt in prayer. And near Tate's foothills, rushing streams carried the mountain's pure waters, used in rituals of cleansing and renewal. Although the structures varied, the purpose remained the same: to honor the sacredness of the land and to prepare the heart for the ascent. Pilgrims often spoke of a moment, somewhere on the trail, different for each mountain, when the air changed. On Fuji, The shift came with the thinning of the forest, where the last pines bowed to the stark beauty of volcanic rock. On Haku, it came when the mist opened suddenly, revealing a glimpse of snow-covered peaks. On Tate, it came when the wind shifted tone, as though singing of ancient spirits moving through the ridges. These moments were quiet, fleeting, but unforgettable. They mark the place where the human world's weight loosened and the mountain's world began. The meaning of the Sanreason deepened with time. In later centuries, scholars and monks mapped spiritual attributes onto the triad, intertwining them with cosmology. Fuji aligned with fire and purity, the upward striving of the spirit. Haku aligned with water and clarity, the gentle flow of understanding. Tate aligned with earth and strength, the grounding of resolve. Together, the three formed a natural mandala, a spiritual compass guiding the seeker toward balance. Even those who never climbed the mountains felt their influence. Farmers offered prayers toward Fuji at planting season. Merchants carrying goods along northern roads bowed in respect when Tate appeared in the distance. Villagers living near Haku placed white stones at their doorways, believing the mountain's serenity would bless their homes. The peaks became woven into the rhythms of daily life, their shadows stretching across the centuries. Artists found endless inspiration in the Sanreason. Painters brushed their forms into landscapes colored with ink, snow, and cloud. Poets compared Fuji's ascent to the rising of a pure heart, Haku's quietness to the stillness of a calm mind, Tate's ruggedness to the fortitude required in times of hardship. These mountain metaphors became part of the nation's silent philosophy, shaping the way people interpreted their trials, their hopes, and their search for meaning. As Japan shifted into more organized eras, the Sanreason remained spiritual anchors. Pilgrimage associations grew, guiding travelers with chants and rituals. Different regions adopted one of the three mountains as spiritual guardians, shaping festivals and traditions around their presence. Some communities even believed that visions seen on the mountains, changes in cloud patterns, unusual bird calls, sudden bursts of wind, were subtle messages from the kami who dwelled within. During the medieval and early modern periods, the interconnected system of roads allowed more pilgrims to reach the sacred peaks. Yet despite the increased foot traffic, the mountains retained their ancient quietness. Footsteps ascended, breaths labored, prayers whispered, but the peaks themselves remained still, as though watching with the patience of stone shaped by centuries. In times of conflict or uncertainty, people turned their hearts toward the mountains. Fuji reminded them that purity remained possible. Haku reminded them that even in turmoil, serenity could be found. Tate reminded them that endurance was a virtue blessed by the land itself. These spiritual lessons slipped gently into the national consciousness, shaping the quiet strengths that supported the culture. When modernization swept across Japan, bringing trains, telegraphs, and new philosophies, many feared that reverence for the peaks would fade. But the opposite occurred. More people than ever sought the mountains, not out of religious duty, but out of longing. As cities grew louder and life grew faster, the mountains remained still, offering the same quiet invitation they had extended for thousands of years. Even in the present day, when travelers climb Fuji for sunrise, hike Tate's rugged ridges in summer, or walk Haku's mist-draped trails in autumn, they feel it, that subtle shift in the air, the gentle stirring of something ancient. The mountains do not speak, yet they communicate in silence. They do not command, yet they guide. They do not demand worship, yet they inspire reverence simply by existing. For the Sanreason are not merely three peaks scattered across the archipelago. They are three voices of the land, three pillars of spirit, three mirrors reflecting the different paths the heart may take. Fuji shows the ascent toward purity. Haku teaches the calm of clarity. Tate reveals the strength found in stillness. And together, they form a sacred triad that continues to shape the spiritual landscape of Japan. not through myth alone, but through the quiet truth carried in every mountain wind. As centuries wove themselves into the quiet tapestry of Japan's spiritual memory, the three sacred mountains continue to stand as towering expressions of the land's inner essence, three presences that shape devotion not through command, but through gentleness. Fuji, Haku, and Tate each carried their own voice, and over the ages, that chorus deepened, echoing through generations who turned to the mountains for comfort, strength, and a sense of belonging that stretched far beyond a single lifetime. Fuji, with its perfect symmetry, remained the mountain of spiritual ascent. Its slopes invited pilgrims to shed the weight of earthly concerns and rise toward purity. The mountain's silhouette became a symbol of clarity in times of confusion. Even travelers who never approached the peak felt its influence simply by glimpsing its form across a distant horizon. To see Fuji was to remember that something serene and steady still existed in the world, something that neither war nor storm could dim. Haku, the White Mountain, held a different presence. Wrapped in clouds for much of the year, it felt like a place where the veil between worlds hung thin as mist. Pilgrims often described the mountain as gentle, even when its trails proved challenging. Its heavy blankets of snow were seen not as burdens, but as blessings, purifying layers laid upon the earth by the mountain's resident kami. Those who climbed Haku encountered long stretches of silence, broken only by the soft sound of wind moving across untouched snowfields. The silence did not feel empty, it felt full, as though holding 1,000 unspoken truths. Tate, watching over the north, carried the spirit of endurance. Its rugged ridges, sharp cliffs, and unpredictable weather demanded humility and strength from those who approached its heights. Travelers often spoke of a quiet respect that settled over them as they walked its paths, a recognition that Tate was a mountain shaped by ages of wind and storm. Climbing it was never easy. Yet those who reached its summit often described a sense of empowerment unlike any other, as if the mountain had lent them a fragment of its unyielding fortitude. Together, these three mountains formed a spiritual triangle that extended far beyond physical geography. The Sanrizen offered pilgrims a kind of sacred circuit, a journey that touched every dimension of the human spirit. Some sought the triad over many years, climbing each mountain at different seasons of life. Others visited only one, yet felt connected to all three through the stories shared in villages, temples, and way stations. In many regions, families kept small household altars dedicated to the Sanrizen. On these altars, they placed small stones gathered from the mountain's foothills, or images brushed with ink to symbolize the peaks. Offerings of rice, water, or evergreen sprigs were placed before these symbols, honoring the mountains not as distant deities, but as protective presences that watched over daily life. Even those who lived far from the peaks found comfort in knowing that the mountains stood steady, enduring through storms and seasons. During certain festivals, villagers carried lanterns carved with patterns of mountains, their warm glow drifting through nighttime streets like floating prayers. The flickering light was meant to honor the spirits believed to dwell within the peaks, guiding them gently back to their realms after traveling unseen through the human world. These rituals reminded communities of the timeless bond between land and life, a bond that survived through every era of change. Pilgrims who attempted the Sanrizen circuit often described how each mountain shaped them differently. Fuji clarified the heart, Haku quieted the mind. Tate strengthened the spirit. The order in which they climbed seemed to influence their experience. Some sought purity first, clarity second, strength last. Others began with Tate, believing they needed fortitude before seeking serenity. There was no correct sequence. The mountains revealed themselves in their own time. Along the routes leading to the peaks, travelers encountered wayside shrines where they could rest, pray, or simply breathe in the mountain air. Some shrines stood beneath ancient cedar trees whose roots wound through the earth like living memory. Others perched on ridgelines, offering views that stretched across valleys, rivers, and distant towns. Each shrine served as a moment of pause, a reminder that the journey was not only physical but deeply interior. During the medieval era, monks and ascetics walked the paths between the Sanriesen as part of spiritual training. These practitioners often lived in mountain huts, meditating through long nights and harsh weather. They believed that the mountains stripped away illusion, revealing truths that could not be seen in the ordinary world. Their teachings describe the Sanriesen as three mirrors, each reflecting a different aspect of the self back into the seeker's heart. In times of conflict, when clans warred and uncertainty shadowed the land, people looked to the mountains for guidance. Tales spread of unusual cloud formations around Haku that foretold early snow. Fires glowing on Fuji slopes were interpreted as warnings or messages from the kami. Sudden storms around Tate were seen as signs of the mountain's protective anger. Even if such interpretations varied, the mountains offered reassurance. They remained constant even when human affairs spiraled into chaos. Artists across the centuries found themselves drawn to the Sanriesen as symbols of stability. Ink painters captured their silhouettes in single brushstrokes, creating images that felt both spontaneous and eternal. Woodblock artists depicted the mountains in every season: Fuji in blue dawn light, Haku in deep winter white, Tate in the luminous greens of early summer. Poets wrote verses comparing human life to mountain paths, sometimes steep, sometimes obscured by mist, yet always leading upward if one continued with patience. By the time Japan entered the modern age, with railways weaving across the land and cities rising quickly into the sky, many feared that the spiritual bond with the mountains might fade. Yet the opposite occurred. People began to seek the mountains with renewed longing, driven by the desire to reconnect with something ancient, something that existed before the pace of modern life scattered attention like wind over grass. Climbers arrived from around the world, eager to experience the Sanriesen. Some came for adventure, but many found something unexpected, a kind of stillness they did not know they were missing. They wrote in journals about how the air felt different on the trails, how the shadows of clouds moved slowly across the slopes, how silence settled with a depth they had never encountered in cities. They described moments when the mountains seemed to breathe with them, guiding their steps. Mount Haku, with its veils of mist, became a favorite among those seeking spiritual renewal. Many who climbed it alone spoke of feeling accompanied, not by other people, but by a presence that softened solitude. Mount Tate, with its rugged ridges, drew those seeking challenge. Its paths tested the body, yet rewarded the spirit, offering views that stirred awe even in seasoned mountaineers. And Fuji, eternally serene, continued to welcome crowds each summer, its summit a beacon for those wishing to witness the sun rise above a world made of cloud and sky. Conservation efforts emerged to protect these sacred landscapes. Trails were reinforced to prevent erosion. Ritual sites were restored. Shrines received new caretakers who blended ancient tradition with modern stewardship. Researchers studied the ecosystem of each mountain, ensuring that the flora and fauna remained balanced. Local communities, recognizing the spiritual and cultural importance of the peaks, dedicated themselves to thoughtful preservation. Yet even with these efforts, the mountains remained unchanged in essence. They accepted the footsteps of pilgrims just as they had accepted those of ancient ascetics. They welcomed prayers whispered by travelers from faraway lands. They offered the same quiet lessons they had offered for centuries, lessons carried not in words, but in wind, stone, and silence. In the evenings, when twilight brushed the peaks in gentle hues, travelers often lingered along the trails, reluctant to leave. The mountains seemed to glow with a light that came not from the sun, but from the depth of their own presence. Clouds drifted slowly past, casting shadows that moved like memories across the slopes. And in those moments, the world felt vast and intimate at once, as though the mountains were drawing each person into a timeless embrace. For the Sanrisin do not ask for devotion. They do not demand prayer or pilgrimage. They simply exist, steadfast, quiet, alive with the breath of the land. They remind those who approach them that purity, serenity, and strength are not distant ideals, but qualities already present within the human heart, waiting to be awakened. And so, the three sacred mountains continue to rise through every season, their peaks glowing in dawn light, their slopes whispering in passing winds, their presence offering calm to a world that often forgets to breathe. Long before roads were carved across the archipelago, long before maps traced its winding mountains and river valleys, there existed a network of paths that felt as old as breath itself. These were the trails of Kumano, threading through forests so deep and moss-laden, they seemed woven from myth rather than soil. Travelers who entered these paths stepped into a world where every leaf shimmered with memory, where the air carried the scent of rain and old stone, and where the presence of the kami lingered like a soft pulse beneath the earth. From the first step, the forest welcomed them not as strangers, but as seekers on a journey older than language. The Kumano Kodo was never a single road, but a living tapestry of pilgrimage routes. Some curled along mountain ridges, where clouds drifted just beyond reach. Others followed the course of ancient rivers, their waters glimmering with reflections of cedar branches that arched like silent guardians. Each trail bore the imprint of centuries, the worn stones shaped by countless footsteps, the shrines tucked beneath natural rock shelters, the faint markers carved into trees by wanderers who walked before written history. These paths were not planned. They were revealed, shaped by the land itself. From as early as the Heian period, pilgrims traveled these routes seeking rebirth, purification, or simply the quiet guidance of the sacred. The forests of Kumano were known as a gateway to the realm where the living world nears its edge and the spiritual world begins. In these depths, the mundane dissolved. Pilgrims walked not to escape life, but to re-enter it with clearer hearts. And so they climbed, descended, and climbed again, moving through landscapes that felt untouched by time. Mist was a constant companion. Some mornings, it clung to the ground like a second skin, softening every stone and branch. Other days, it drifted in delicate veils that wrapped around the trees, revealing and concealing the world with each quiet shift. Pilgrims believed the mist was the presence of the kami, watching their journey with gentle discretion. They often paused when the fog grew thick, bowing their heads in humble gratitude, for such moments were seen as blessings, proof that the divine walked beside them. The trails led to the heart of the sacred triad. Kumano Hongu Taisha, Kumano Nachai Taisha, and Kumano Hayatama Taisha. Each shrine held its own ancient power, tied to rivers, waterfalls, or the depths of the forest. They were places of prayer, of rest, of transformation. For pilgrims, reaching these shrines was not the end of their journey, but a turning point, a moment when the spirit was cleansed by proximity to the sacred. Each shrine was a threshold, and each threshold deepened the meaning of the next step taken. Along the trails, small stone statues stood hidden beneath ferns and moss. Some bore the serene expressions of Jizo, guardian of travelers and children. Others represented mountain spirits or ancient deities interwoven with local belief. Pilgrims often left offerings before these statues: pebbles, rice, small pieces of cloth, tokens of respect for the unseen protectors of the path. The statues were not merely markers, they were companions, silent witnesses to centuries of devotion. As the pilgrims walked, the forest seemed to breathe with them. Leaves rustled in slow waves. Birdsong echoed through distant hollows. Water dripped rhythmically from overgrown branches onto stones smoothed by time. The soundscape of the Kumano Kodo felt like a sacred language, one spoken in tones of wind and water. Even those who entered the forest weary from long days of travel found their breath slowing, their minds softening, their burdens loosening. The forest did not demand reverence, it invited it naturally. Some pilgrims walked alone, seeking solitude. Others traveled in small groups, sharing stories as they moved through the shadowed groves. But every pilgrim, regardless of company, eventually encountered the trail's deeper silence, a silence that did not exclude sound, but embraced it gently. In this silence, steps felt lighter, emotions clearer, and the presence of the land more intimate. It was said that the Kumano Kodo revealed not answers, but openings, spaces where one could finally listen to what had long been muffled by the noise of daily life. The trails varied in difficulty. Some followed gentle slopes lined with soft earth and fallen leaves. Others climbed steep ridges marked by uneven stones that challenged even seasoned travelers. Ascending these sections could feel like walking through the spine of the mountain itself. But instead of frustration, pilgrims found purpose. They believed each stone tested the sincerity of the heart, each step cleansing something hidden within. Hardship was not an obstacle, it was part of the ritual. Rain transformed the trails into shimmering ribbons of light. Water washed over the stones, revealing their age, their texture, their quiet endurance. Pilgrims often walked in the rain without complaint, allowing the drops to soak into their clothing, their hair, their skin. The rain carried a kind of purification, gentle, insistent, and deeply symbolic. Many said the forest smelled sweetest after rainfall, as though the earth itself exhaled in relief. Nights along the Kumano Kodo held their own mystery. When pilgrims rested in mountain lodges or sheltered beneath simple roofs, they listened to the forest hum with nocturnal life. Crickets sang in rhythmic waves. Wind stirred the bamboo groves in soft murmurs. The darkness felt complete, yet comforting, another veil through which the spirit wandered freely. In these hours, pilgrims reflected on their journey, their footsteps still echoing within their memory. By dawn, the forest shifted again. Light filtered through the canopy in long beams, illuminating tiny particles of mist floating in the air. Pilgrims rose, their bodies sore yet renewed. They resumed walking with quiet determination, knowing that every step carried them deeper into the ancient embrace of Kumano. The morning air, cool and damp, felt like a blessing placed upon their shoulders. Pilgrims often spoke of striking moments along the trails, moments when the forest opened unexpectedly, revealing sweeping views of valleys filled with clouds, or when a single shaft of sunlight illuminated a shrine hidden in shadow. These moments were fleeting but unforgettable. They felt like messages, like the kami whispering encouragement from somewhere just beyond sight. One of the most revered sections of the pilgrimage was the Daemonzaka, a long approach lined with towering cedar trees. The stones beneath the pilgrims' feet had been worn smooth by centuries of passage. The cedars, reaching skyward with monumental presence, created a corridor that felt like the entrance to another world. As pilgrims walked through this living avenue, many felt an overwhelming sense of humility, as though stepping through the heartbeat of the forest. Further along the trail, waterfalls emerged from the mountainsides, streams plunging from great heights into pools that shimmered with ethereal clarity. The most famous of these was Nachai Falls, a cascading torrent that seemed to descend from the sky itself. Pilgrims spoke of feeling the spray upon their faces as a kind of spiritual cleansing, a blessing from the kami who dwelled within the water's roar. Standing before the waterfall, travelers often wept without knowing why. This was the power of the Kumano Kodo. It did not ask pilgrims to believe anything specific. It simply offered an experience, one that opened the heart and softened the boundaries between human and divine. By the time the sun dipped low each day, casting long shadows across the trails, pilgrims found themselves changed. Not through grand revelation, but through the accumulation of quiet moments. Stones beneath their feet, mist brushing their skin, the murmuring of ancient trees. They emerged from the forest carrying something the trail had given them: a deeper breath, a clearer mind, a gentler heart. For the Kumano Kodo was more than a path. It was a living presence, a sacred thread woven through earth and memory, guiding all who walked it toward a softer understanding of themselves and the world they moved through. As pilgrims continued deeper into the Kumano Mountains, the ancient roots seemed to fold the world into a gentler rhythm. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer, and the sounds more hushed, as though each step carried them farther from the concerns of ordinary life and closer to the quiet sanctuary of the unseen. The trails did not lead in straight lines. They curved, dipped, rose, and meandered with the natural shape of the land, following the contours of hillsides that had held these paths for over 1,000 years. Walking them was not merely a journey across terrain, but a passage through layers of memory left by emperors, monks, and countless anonymous souls seeking renewal. In the Heian period, pilgrimage along the Kumano Kodo became a rite of passage for the aristocracy. Emperors and noblewomen traveled with retinues that stretched for miles, bringing priests, attendants, and supplies sufficient for weeks in the mountains. Though they moved with grandeur, even they felt humbled by the forest's enormity. Diaries from that era describe moments when court ladies, accustomed to palace walls and silken chambers, found themselves reduced to awed silence by the sight of ancient cedars rising like pillars into the mist. Their elaborate robes grew heavy with mountain rain, yet their spirits felt unexpectedly light. But the Kumano Kodo was not solely the domain of the elite. Farmers, monks, warriors, and wanderers walked the same stones, sharing the path in a rare equality. In these forests, people were not defined by rank, they were defined by sincerity. Whether dressed in court garments or simple hemp robes, each pilgrim's footsteps were absorbed by the same earth, softened by the same moss, watched by the same unseen spirits. Within the Kumano forests, the world's divisions dissolved. The trails passed through areas where the land seemed sculpted by myth. There were narrow passes carved between immense boulders, believed to be places where deities had once rested. There were clearings where sunlight pooled like golden water, creating oases of warmth in the cool, shadowed woods. And there were sections where small stone cairns lined the path, stacks left by travelers who placed one stone for safe passage and another for gratitude. Over time, these cairns became miniature mountain ranges of their own, humble monuments to countless hopes whispered into the forest. One of the most revered practices along the Kumano Kodo was the ritual of ogami, a simple but profound act of raising one's hands in prayer at particular sacred spots. These locations were marked by wooden signs or carved stones, but more often they were recognized by atmosphere alone. Pilgrims would step into a patch of forest where the air felt charged, denser, quieter, infused with presence. Here they paused, bowed, and offered their thoughts to the invisible kami. This act, repeated at dozens of points along the trail, transformed the journey into a continuous conversation with the sacred. Water played a powerful role on these routes. Mountain springs emerged from hidden crevices, flowing into wooden basins where pilgrims washed their hands and rinsed their mouths. This cleansing ritual symbolized the shedding of impurity, preparing the spirit to meet the divine. The coldness of the water startled the skin, but the shock brought clarity, anchoring the pilgrim more deeply in the present moment. Streams crossed by wooden bridges whispered softly beneath, carrying with them the echoes of ancient prayers. As pilgrims approached the inner regions of the Kumano Mountains, the forest grew denser, its green tones deepening into shades that felt almost otherworldly. Ferns unfurled like delicate scrolls, moss-covered stones in velvety layers. The trees stood in clusters that resembled natural cathedrals, their trunks forming living pillars that supported a canopy high above. In these places, even the wind seemed to move with intent, brushing lightly through leaves as if guiding the pilgrims onward. The spiritual gravity of the trails grew stronger as they neared Kumano Hongu Taisha, the great shrine that lay at the heart of these ancient roots. Pilgrims spoke of a curious sensation that often came upon them days before reaching the shrine, a sense of being drawn forward as though the land itself recognized their presence and reached out to meet them. Some called it anticipation. Others called it the mountain's whisper. Whatever its nature, the feeling left no pilgrim untouched. Kumano Hongu Taisha, with its ancient cypress architecture and towering torii gates, rose like a sacred breath in the clearing. The approach to the shrine passed through quiet forests, across wooden bridges, and along pathways lined with lanterns that seemed to hold fragments of starlight even during the day. Pilgrims arriving here often felt a surge of emotion, not because the shrine demanded reverence, but because their long journey had prepared their hearts to feel deeply. In the shrine's inner grounds, the roofs curved gently like unfolding wings, and the gravel pathways shimmered with the morning's dew. Priests in white garments moved with deliberate grace, tending to rituals that had persisted for centuries. The air felt different, still, yet vibrant, like the breath of the mountain held in suspension. Some pilgrims knelt beneath ancient trees, their heads bowed in gratitude. Others wandered slowly, letting the silence settle in their bones. After visiting Hongu Taisha, many pilgrims continued to Nachai Taisha, where the trail descended into valleys filled with the sound of rushing water. The path wound through dense forests before revealing the breathtaking sight of Nachai Falls, cascading from a height that made it appear like an endless ribbon of light. The waterfall was considered the dwelling place of a powerful deity, and pilgrims often approached its base with trembling awe. The spray touched their faces like a blessing, cool and invigorating, as if washing away the remnants of long-traveled dust. Nearby, Nachai Taisha stood on the slope, its vivid vermilion structures contrasted against deep green forest. Lanterns hung in rows, their shapes glowing softly with the wind's movement. Pilgrims climbed long flights of stone steps leading toward the shrine, their breath steadying with each rise. Every step offered a moment of reflection, one stone for the past, one for the present, one for the future. The third shrine of the sacred triad, Hayatama Taisha, welcomed travelers near the mouth of the Kumano River. Its grounds were open and bright, filled with ancient trees whose roots twisted like threads of memory. One such tree, the sacred Naga tree, had stood for centuries, its leaves believed to protect against misfortune. Pilgrims often took one leaf home, placing it in sacred pouches for protection. At Hayatama, the boundary between water and land felt thin, as though the river carried stories from the upper mountains to the sea, completing a spiritual cycle. For many, the pilgrimage did not end at the shrines. The journey continued in the quiet transformation felt afterward, the feeling of breathing more deeply, walking more gently, and seeing the world with softer eyes. The forest remained with them long after their return. The scent of cedar, the sound of rain falling on stone, the sight of lanterns glowing in the dusk. Even years later, they could close their eyes and recall the exact texture of moss beneath their hands, the coolness of a mountain spring, the hush of mist drifting across an old stone staircase. Modern travelers who walk the Kumano Kodo feel these same echoes. Though guided maps and marked paths make the journey accessible, the forest retains its ancient gravity. The stones are still worn from the footsteps of emperors. The trees still arch overhead in quiet reverence. The mist still moves like a living presence among the trunks. And every traveler, whether seeking enlightenment or simply a moment of calm, finds themselves opening in ways they did not expect. The Kumano Kodo endures because it does not force revelation. It offers space. It offers stillness. It offers the gentle kindness of a world that has held countless journeys in its moss-covered hands. To walk these trails is to feel time soften, to listen to the forest's whisper, to surrender to the quiet truth that the sacred is often found in the smallest, most unassuming steps. And those who complete the pilgrimage carry its breath with them, not as a memory of distance traveled, but as a soft, enduring place in the heart where forest, mist, and spirit still walk beside them. Long before modern borders, before cities rose along coastlines and valleys bustled with life, there were mountains so deep, so quiet, and so vast in their presence that those who entered them felt the world shift. These mountains, wrapped in layers of mist and silence, became the cradle of an ancient spiritual tradition called Shugendo, their way of training and testing. It was a path shaped not by doctrine alone, but by earth, wind, water, and the raw pulse of the land. In these sacred heights, certain seekers withdrew from the noise of the world, surrendering themselves to the elements in search of transformation. The mountain ascetics, known as Yamabushi, emerged from this tradition. They were wanderers, mystics, and practitioners who believed that enlightenment was not found in distant heavens, but cultivated in the body through trial, endurance, and communion with nature itself. To them, the mountains were not obstacles. They were teachers, stern yet compassionate, revealing truths through hardship, solitude, and silence. Each summit, waterfall, and forest carried spiritual significance. Each breath drawn in the thin mountain air felt like a step closer to awakening. In the earliest days, Shugendo grew from the meeting of Shinto's reverence for the natural world and Buddhism's profound introspection. The mountains, already home to myriad kami, became living mandalas where human experience intertwined with sacred presence. Yamabushi believed that by subjecting themselves to nature's extremes, cold water, steep cliffs, storm winds, they could strip away illusion and reveal the pure essence beneath. Their practice was not an escape from the world, but a deep immersion into its most elemental truths. Many practitioners began their training with a simple decision: to step away from the familiar and into the unknown. They entered the mountains with only a robe, a conch shell horn, and an unshakable will. The forests greeted them with shifting light and dense shadows, the trails rising steeply into zones of increasing solitude. The deeper they climbed, the quieter the world became. Birdsong echoed through ravines like distant bells. Leaves whispered beneath their feet. Rivers, flowing from peaks snow-fed and ancient, murmured prayers of their own. The first trials of Shugendo were often tests of endurance. Yamabushi disciplined their bodies through long treks across treacherous cliffs, fasting, and meditative walking called Nubu, in which they crossed sacred boundaries into the heart of the mountain. They slept in caves carved by centuries of wind, their only warmth coming from small fires fed by fallen branches. Nights were cold, the darkness punctuated by the calls of distant animals. Yet in these conditions, practitioners learned to listen, to the land, to the spirit, and to the tremor of their own inner voice. Waterfalls played a central role in their training. Yamabushi sought purification beneath cascades that plunged from great heights, letting icy water crash upon their shoulders until their breath grew ragged and their thoughts dissolved into raw sensation. These rituals were not acts of suffering for its own sake. They were meant to erode the hardened layers of the heart. Under the waterfall's relentless pressure, practitioners confronted fear, doubt, and attachment, emerging afterward with a profound clarity that could not be attained through words alone. Cliffs and steep ridges offered another form of trial. Yamabushi often crossed precarious paths carved into the sides of mountains, trusting their feet to stones smoothed by countless seasons. These crossings symbolized the delicate balance between life and death, body and spirit. With each careful step, practitioners cultivated unwavering focus, learning to move not with hesitation but with quiet confidence. The cliffs did not frighten them. They revealed the fragility of human life and the importance of living with intention. Silence, too, was an essential teacher. In the forests of Kumano, Sansan, and other sacred ranges, Yamabushi spent long hours in meditation, surrounded only by the rustle of leaves and the distant sigh of wind. The mountains were vast, yet somehow intimate. Practitioners often describe the sensation of being watched, not with judgment, but with ancient awareness. The land itself seemed alive, responding to the presence of those who sought communion with sincerity. One of the most iconic symbols of the Yamabushi was the horagai, a conch shell horn used to signal presence and intention across the mountains. When blown, its sound resonated through valleys and forested slopes like a deep, lingering call. It was both instrument and prayer, a bridge between the human world and the realm of spirits. Pilgrims hearing its tone often felt shivers, as though the mountains themselves were answering. As Shugendo grew, its teachings expanded into intricate rites and rituals. Yamabushi practiced Sanrinshin, meditation on the three sacred realms of mountains, rivers, and forests. They engaged in fire rituals, chanting mantras as flames danced into the sky. They performed ascetic rites in secluded groves, believing these acts harmonized body and spirit with the energies of the land. Everything was interconnected. Everything carried deeper meaning. Shugendo was also a tradition of transmission. Masters passed knowledge to disciples through experience rather than lecture. Instead of long discourses, the master might simply lead the disciple to a cliff ledge, gesture toward the sprawling valley below, and say nothing. In that wordless moment, the disciple understood. The mountain itself was the teaching. Wisdom did not come from explanations. It came from presence, from confronting the vastness and feeling oneself become small, then expansive again. Despite the rigors of training, Shugendo was not meant to sever practitioners from the human world entirely. Yamabushi often descended from the mountains to offer healing, blessings, or guidance to villages nearby. Their presence was seen as a bridge between worlds. They carried the purity of the high places with them, bringing comfort to those who sought relief from sickness or misfortune. Villagers welcomed them with reverence, offering food and shelter in exchange for prayers and protection. The mountains of Sanzen, Mount Haguro, Mount Garsen, and Mount Udono became central to Shugendo practice. Each mountain symbolized a stage of spiritual transformation, birth, death, and rebirth. Pilgrims walked these mountains in rituals that spanned days, embracing the cycles of existence through physical journey. On Mount Haguro, they stepped beneath towering cedars that filtered light into gentle emerald hues. On Mount Garsen, they traversed snowfields that gleamed beneath cold skies. On Mount Udono, they encountered sacred springs and hidden shrines that represented the mysteries of the unseen. The seasons shaped the lessons. In spring, waterfalls flowed with renewed vigor, offering cleansing at its most intense. Summer brought lush growth, the forest vibrant and alive, testing endurance in humidity and heat. Autumn colored the mountains in brilliant red and gold, teaching impermanence as leaves fell with delicate finality. Winter wrapped the peaks in silence and hardship, demanding resilience and granting deep introspection. Throughout history, Shugendo endured periods of suppression, times when governments sought to control or prohibit mountain worship. Yet the faith survived, held quietly in the hearts of those who walked the sacred paths in secrecy. Even when temples were closed or rituals banned, the mountains remained as they always had been, open, patient, and ready to welcome practitioners back as soon as they were able to return. In the modern era, Shugendo practitioners continue their training, preserving traditions that have endured for over 1,000 years. The Yamabushi still walk the ancient trails, still chant beneath waterfalls, still blow the horagai into the mountain wind. Some people join for brief pilgrimages, seeking moments of clarity. Others dedicate their lives to the practice, embracing the solitude of the mountains as their true home. The spirit of Shugendo lives on not as an echo of the past, but as a living tradition carried by those who find meaning in its demanding yet deeply compassionate path. For in Shugendo, the mountain is not merely a place. It is a teacher, a mirror, a presence that reveals what is hidden and softens what is hardened. And those who walk its slopes with sincerity discover a truth whispered through wind and stone, that enlightenment is not distant, but found where silence, hardship, and reverence meet. As centuries turned, the mountains that cradled Shugendo became more than mere landscapes. They became living archives of whispered prayers, forgotten trials, and the quiet endurance of countless seekers. The Yamabushi who walked their ridges left no monuments except the worn stones beneath their feet, yet their presence shaped the mountains as surely as the mountains shaped them. Every gust of wind passing through cedar branches, every drop of water falling from moss-dark rocks carried echoes of their long devotion. The life of a Yamabushi was never linear. It unfolded in cycles, mirroring the rhythms of nature. Practitioners often spoke of an inner spiral, a path that wound through discipline, surrender, revelation, and return. They might leave the world for months, living deep within the mountains, only to reappear in a nearby village bringing blessings and quiet wisdom. Then, as the seasons shifted or the spirit called them again, they would vanish once more into the forests, their figures swallowed by shadow and mist. To the villagers, the Yamabushi existed in a space between myth and humanity. They arrived unannounced, their garments adorned with small bells, conch horns slung across their backs, their steps light despite the steep terrain. Children watched them with wide eyes, sensing something ancient in their presence. Elders bowed deeply, understanding the depth of their practice. And though Yamabushi often spoke little, their silence carried meaning the people recognized instinctively. Among the most sacred practices of Shugendo was Sokushinbatsu, the extreme ascetic path in which a practitioner sought ultimate unity with the land, even after death. Though few ever undertook it, the idea reflected the core belief of Shugendo, that the body and spirit were not separate, that enlightenment required full immersion into nature's vastness. Those who attempted this practice began by purifying their bodies through strict diets and meditation, gradually withdrawing deeper into the mountains until the boundary between self and world dissolved. Even after this path faded from acceptance, its legacy shaped the reverence with which Yamabushi approached their training. But not all aspects of Shugendo demanded such extremes. Many rites were grounded in mindfulness of the senses. Yamabushi would meditate while holding stones warmed by the sun, feeling their weight and texture as symbols of Earth's constancy. They would sit beside waterfalls, their breaths syncing with the rhythm of cascading water. They practiced ritual walking, letting their feet become extensions of the mountain's own movement. And in moments of reflection, they listened to the forest with full presence, hearing not only sounds but intentions, silences, and the subtle shifts of life within the canopy. Nighttime in the mountains held a power all its own. Yamabushi often performed rites beneath starlit skies, the constellations glimmering through gaps in the trees. Fires burned low and steady, casting golden light onto moss-covered stones. The practitioners sat in circles, chanting mantras that rose and fell like distant waves. The mountains responded with their own nocturnal voices, the hoot of an owl deeper in the forest, the rustle of leaves stirred by unseen creatures, the hollow hum of wind moving across high cliffs. The mountains felt alive in the dark, as though breathing alongside those who sought their wisdom. Some rites required practitioners to spend entire nights alone in the forest, without fire or shelter. In these vigils, fear often surfaced, the primal kind woven into the human instinct for survival. But the Yamabushi did not flee from fear. They met it with stillness, allowing the darkness to reveal its own lessons. Slowly, fear softened into awareness, then into acceptance, and finally into a deeper intimacy with the mountains themselves. In these moments, the boundary between human vulnerability and natural presence faded into something vast and unbroken. As dawn approached, the forest transformed. Light seeped between branches, illuminating the world in strokes of pale gold. Yamabushi stood from their meditation spots, stretching their limbs and breathing in the cold morning air. Dew glistened on leaves and spider webs, tiny crystals catching the first rays of sunlight. For the practitioners, this moment, when darkness surrendered to dawn, symbolized awakening. It was the mountain's reminder that renewal follows even the deepest shadows. Shugendo's teachings expanded not only through hardship, but through the beauty found along the trails. Yamabushi often paused to observe small details. A single white flower blooming between stones, a river bending around an ancient root, the way clouds shifted shape above distant ridges. These moments were seen as teachings in themselves, subtle, patient, and profound. They invited practitioners to recognize the divine not only in grand mountains, but in the smallest gestures of nature. One of the most enduring teachings of Shugendo was the concept of Kechai Myaku, the spiritual lineage that connected teacher and disciple. This lineage was not defined solely by instruction, but by shared experience. Masters and disciples climbed mountains together, endured storms side by side, meditated beneath the same waterfalls. Over time, their breaths aligned, their intentions harmonized, and the teachings passed not through words but through presence. When disciples eventually walked the mountains alone, they carried their master's silent guidance with them like a steady flame. Seasonal pilgrimages were central to Shugendo. In spring, Yamabushi celebrated renewal through rites involving mountain flowers and flowing waters. Summer demanded endurance as practitioners climbed steep trails beneath humid skies. Autumn offered lessons in impermanence, the falling leaves reminding them that all things shift, change, and fade. Winter challenged their resilience, snow transforming familiar routes into landscapes of stark purity. Through each season, the mountains revealed different faces, each one a teacher with its own voice. With time, Shugendo became deeply integrated into regional culture. Villagers invited Yamabushi to perform protective rituals in their homes or bless new harvests. Festivals were held in honor of the mountains, blending dance, song, and prayer. Children learned the rhythms of nature through stories passed down by their elders, stories carried from Yamabushi who had walked the sacred paths before them. The mountains shaped community life not through force, but through quiet presence. During the Meiji era, when the government briefly banned Shugendo in an effort to separate Shinto and Buddhism, many feared the tradition would vanish. Temples were closed, rites forbidden, and practitioners forced to adopt new roles or hide their practices. Yet the mountains held their memory. Yamabushi continued their training in secret, walking night paths known only to them, chanting beneath waterfalls before dawn. When the ban eventually lifted, Shugendo resurfaced not as a relic of the past, but as a resilient, living tradition that had resisted silence with the strength of stone and root. In the modern age, Shugendo has found new life. Practitioners continue to walk ancient trails, blowing the conch shell horn to awaken the mountains. Pilgrims from around the world join seasonal retreats, learning the old practices from contemporary Yamabushi who balance tradition with compassionate guidance. Waterfall rituals still echo with chants that dissolve into mist. Fire ceremonies still blaze beneath star-filled skies, and the mountains remain what they have always been: vast, patient, unchanging sanctuaries for seekers of every era. Those who walk the paths today describe the same sensations felt by ancient practitioners: the grounding weight of stone beneath the feet, the clarity brought by cold water on the skin, the humility of standing before a cliff face sculpted by centuries, the peace that rises from deep within when the forest falls completely silent. Shugendo lives not in texts, but in these experiences, embodied, weathered, breathed into the bones. And at the heart of it all lies the same quiet truth: the mountains teach through presence. They reveal what words cannot. They show that the sacred is not distant, but woven into every breath, every step, every moment when the heart is willing to listen. Those who return from the mountains, whether after days or years, carry that presence with them. It softens their voices, steadies their steps, and deepens their gaze. They walk through the world with a gentler rhythm, their spirits shaped by wind, stone, and silence. For Shugendo is not merely a tradition. It is a way of being, a way that begins in the mountains and continues in the quiet places within us all. In the modern age, when cities pulse with electric light and roads wind in concrete threads across the landscape, Japan's sacred mountains remain as they have always been, quiet, immense, and patient. They stand like ancient guardians on the horizon, watching over a country that has changed beyond anything the early pilgrims could have imagined. Yet despite new technologies, new rhythms, and new ways of living, the mountains still call to people with the same gentle insistence. Their presence invites pause, reflection, and reverence. And still, as in centuries past, those who enter their forests feel something within them soften. Modern Japan has woven its own relationship with these mountains, one that balances the pace of contemporary life with the timeless breath of the sacred. The peaks are no longer distant or inaccessible, and yet they have not lost the aura that makes them holy. Paths once used by emperors, monks, and wanderers now welcome hikers, families, and travelers from around the world. The trails remain quiet, the forests deep, and the air touched with a purity that feels almost unchanged across the centuries. What has shifted is not the mountains themselves, but the way people protect and approach them. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, a growing awareness of cultural preservation brought new energy to safeguarding these sacred spaces. Conservation groups, shrine caretakers, local communities, and national organizations began working together to ensure that the mountain's natural beauty and spiritual importance endured. This effort was not one of isolation or keeping the world away. Rather, it was an invitation, a gentle plea that visitors step onto these trails with humility and care, carrying forward the reverence that generations before them had held. Modern hikers often begin their journeys the same way pilgrims once did, by bowing at the foot of a trail, offering a small gesture of respect. Some bow before torii gates that open into forests, whispering with old prayers. Others pause by stone markers that once guided ancient travelers. They may not know the rituals of the Yamabushi or the stories of the Sanrizen, yet something instinctive moves them to quiet their hearts. The mountains, unchanged in their presence, remind newcomers how to approach gently. As interest in sacred landscapes grew, Japan took deliberate steps to preserve these mountain traditions. UNESCO recognized pilgrimage routes like the Kumano Kodo as World Heritage Sites, acknowledging not only their natural beauty, but their profound cultural significance. This global recognition brought pilgrims from distant countries, many unaware of the mountain's deeper meanings, yet eager to walk paths that had carried footsteps for over a millennium. And as new visitors arrived, guides and caretakers began sharing the stories, myths, and spiritual practices that shaped these trails. Modern stewardship became not only a matter of conservation, but of storytelling, ensuring that the mountain's ancient voice was not lost in the rush of the world. Shrines at the base of sacred mountains adapted gracefully to the new era. Their priests, dressed in traditional garments, continued rituals passed down through generations. They tended wooden structures polished by centuries of devotion, repaired torii gates touched by storms, and swept gravel paths that shimmered in the morning sun. At times, priests welcomed volunteers to help maintain the sacred grounds, teaching them how to clean shrine roofs, care for lanterns, and honor the spaces with quiet, intentional movements. These acts connected modern hands to ancient traditions. Across the country, environmental conservation became a priority. Forest rangers, ecologists, and local volunteers collaborated to monitor the health of mountain ecosystems. They studied the delicate balance of flora and fauna, protected endangered species, and restored trails damaged by erosion. Their work ensured that visitors could climb safely while preserving the mountain's natural spirit. In many regions, hiking was limited to certain seasons or routes to prevent overuse, allowing the mountains time to heal, breathe, and rest. Technology found its place quietly within these efforts. Weather stations perched unobtrusively among the trees, measuring shifts in temperature and rainfall. Digital maps guided travelers along safe paths, while drones surveyed remote cliffs to assess landslide risks. But even with these tools, the heart of preservation remained rooted in ancient understanding. Caretakers listened to the land, reading the subtle signs of changing seasons, studying the moss on old stones, watching the way clouds gathered around peaks. The mountains, after all, spoke not only through their beauty, but through their rhythms. Local communities near sacred mountains played an essential role. Villages that had once served as pilgrimage stations gradually evolved into hubs for cultural exchange. Inns welcomed hikers from around the world, offering traditional meals and warm hospitality that mirrored the spirit of old mountain lodges. Elders shared stories passed down from ancestors, tales of deities who protected the peaks, of ascetics who sought enlightenment in hidden valleys, of storms believed to be messages from the kami. These stories breathed life into the mountains, giving them voices that resonated in the hearts of modern listeners. Pilgrims of the new era traveled with different intentions from those of the past. Some came seeking escape from the noise of urban life, craving silence more than revelation. Others sought to reconnect with heritage, walking the same paths as distant ancestors. And many came not out of religious devotion, but from a longing for presence, for a chance to breathe in a world that rarely allows for stillness. The mountains welcomed them all, offering serenity in the rustle of leaves, clarity in the thin air near the peaks, and gentleness in the coolness of forest shade. As travelers walked, they discovered that the mountain's sacred essence remained accessible even without rituals or formal practice. A hiker pausing at a cliff overlook might suddenly feel a swell of emotion, touched by the quiet expanse of valleys stretching beneath them. A visitor sitting beside a mountain spring might sense the purity of water flowing from ancient stone. A pilgrim resting beneath a cedar tree centuries old might feel, for a moment, the weight of time fall away. Modern artists continue to be inspired by these mountains. Photographers captured the interplay of light and shadow across their ridges. Poets wrote verses about dawn rising over Fuji, mist weaving through Kumano, and snow shimmering on Haku. Musicians composed pieces inspired by the rhythm of footsteps on stone steps and the echo of the wind through bamboo forests. These creative expressions carried the mountain's spirit into new forms, allowing people who had never set foot on the trails to feel glimpses of their beauty. Educational programs brought students into the forests to learn about both ecology and spirituality. Teachers led children along gentle trails, teaching them how to notice fungus on fallen logs, how to identify bird calls, how to bow respectfully at small wayside shrines. Students learned that the mountains were not isolated treasures. They were living ecosystems, interconnected with the culture, history, and well-being of the community. These teachings ensured that reverence for the land remained alive in future generations. Perhaps one of the most profound aspects of modern preservation was its emphasis on coexistence. Rather than separating sacred mountains from human touch, Japan embraced a model where people engaged with the mountains mindfully. Conservation didn't mean keeping people away. It meant guiding them to walk with care. The goal was not to freeze the mountains in a perfect, untouched state, but to protect them so they could continue to breathe and evolve. Even as trains carried visitors to mountain stations and highways brought them closer to foothills, the spirit of the mountains remained unbroken. Travelers stepping from train platforms often felt a quiet shift as soon as they inhaled the cool mountain air. the noise of the world softened. The heart steadied, and the mountains, towering above with their ancient calm, offered the same silent welcome they had offered countless pilgrims before. For in the modern age, the sacred mountains are not relics of a distant past, they are bridges. They connect the present with memory, the human world with the divine, and the rush of daily life with the stillness that lies beneath it. And as long as people continue to walk their trails with humility and care, the mountains will continue to rise, quiet and enduring, holding the stories of all who came and all who will come after. In the unfolding years of the modern era, the sacred mountains of Japan continue to shape the hearts of those who approach them, even as the world grew more connected, more hurried, and more overwhelmed with noise. Their forms still rose above the horizon with the same ancient grace, guiding travelers, pilgrims, and wanderers toward a sense of grounding. But the role they played began to shift subtly, not only as places of worship and pilgrimage, but also as sanctuaries of memory, conservation, and cultural rebirth. In towns and villages near the sacred peaks, the rhythm of daily life was still measured by the mountain's breath. Elders woke early to sweep shrine paths or tend small gardens filled with mountain herbs. Monks walked along ridges at dawn, listening to the wind move through cedar branches like a quiet sutra. Children on their way to school often glanced toward the peaks, their silhouettes rising through morning mist, as familiar as the rooflines of their homes. This sense of belonging to the land and to its spirit remained one of the mountain's most enduring legacies. But even as these traditions persisted, new responsibilities arose. Climate shifts brought unpredictable weather to high altitudes, warmer winters, heavier rains, sudden storms that changed the character of certain trails. Local conservationists noticed subtle changes in vegetation along the slopes, moss drying earlier in the season, alpine plants retreating to higher ground, and new species appearing where none had grown before. These shifts were not crises, but reminders, gentle, persistent reminders, that the mountains, though eternal in spirit, were part of an interdependent world that required care. In response, preservation efforts deepened. Teams of ecologists worked alongside shrine caretakers, combining scientific knowledge with centuries-old intuition. They studied soil erosion, monitored wildlife migration, and restored fragile habitats. Paths once trampled by heavy foot traffic were rerouted or reinforced with natural materials. Wooden boardwalks were constructed along sensitive wetlands, allowing visitors to experience the land without harming it. These gestures were quiet but profound, acts of stewardship honoring the mountain's ancient spirit. Shrines, too, became centers of preservation. Priests collaborated with environmental groups, offering blessings for conservation projects and hosting community gatherings focused on sustainable practices. They spoke to visitors about the importance of leaving no trace, not as a rule to follow, but as a kindness offered to the mountains themselves. Rituals were adapted to highlight ecological mindfulness. Water purification ceremonies using spring water carefully sourced, fire rituals held only in safe, designated spaces, and seasonal festivals designed to educate as much as to celebrate. Among the most deeply cherished traditions was the autumn festival held at the base of many sacred mountains. Lanterns were lit along forest paths, their warm light weaving through the trees like drifting fireflies. Villagers and travelers gathered to offer thanks for the year's blessings, bringing fruits, rice, and small handcrafted tokens. Children carried tiny lanterns shaped like peaks, symbolic of the mountain's guidance through changing seasons. Musicians played flutes whose melodies echoed softly through roots and branches, blending with the sound of leaves brushing against one another. These festivals reminded all who attended that gratitude was not merely emotion, it was a practice, a way of living gently. Modern pilgrims arrived by train and bus, some carrying high-tech gear, others arriving with nothing but sturdy shoes and quiet intentions. They stepped onto trails worn smooth by 1,000 years, entering the forests with a sense of reverence they could not fully explain. For even without centuries of tradition, the mountains spoke through atmosphere alone. The coolness of the air, the depth of the silence, the shifting patterns of light that filtered through the canopy in slow, sacred rhythms. Many visitors traveled alone, seeking a quiet escape from the endless demands of modern life. Others came in pairs or small groups, talking softly as they walked. But all found themselves falling silent at certain points along the path. For instance, when a break in the trees revealed a sweeping valley filled with clouds, or when the trail narrowed beside a stream whose waters shimmered like polished jade. These moments were not planned or forced. They emerged naturally from the land's quiet grandeur. Technology offered both challenges and benefits. On one hand, social media introduced the mountains to new audiences worldwide, sometimes attracting more visitors than the fragile ecosystems could support. On the other hand, digital tools allowed for education on responsible travel, with signs and apps teaching visitors how to tread lightly, respect sacred areas, and honor local customs. Conservationists used drones to survey landslides or track endangered species. Rangers installed discreet sensors to monitor trail conditions. And in all these ways, technology became not an intrusion, but a companion to tradition. Yet even with these modern tools, the essence of the mountains remained untouched. Travelers still paused to purify their hands at forest springs, the cold water stinging their skin with clarity. They still bowed before Torii gates, stepping into realms where the air felt subtly different. They still sat beneath ancient trees, letting silence settle into the spaces where thoughts once churned. The mountain's teachings continued, not through speech, but through presence. Some hikers encountered Yamabushi along the trails, their conch horns echoing through the valleys like primordial calls. Though fewer in number than in centuries past, the mountain ascetics remained an integral part of the mountain's legacy. They greeted travelers quietly, offering blessings or simple guidance about the path ahead. Many visitors, touched by the encounter, found themselves contemplating the deeper roots of the tradition, how these practitioners had walked the mountains long before modern conveniences existed, relying solely on endurance, faith, and the land's guidance. As modern people sought meaning in a world increasingly saturated with information, the mountains offered a rare kind of clarity. The presence of cedar trunks rising like columns of a natural cathedral, the sound of wind brushing through bamboo groves, the sight of distant peaks softened by morning haze, all these elements created a space where the soul could breathe freely. Travelers often described feeling reset. After walking even a short stretch of mountain trail, as though the land had quietly rearranged the scattered pieces of their inner world. Art and scholarship continued to flourish around the sacred peaks. Researchers studied ancient pilgrimage diaries, reconstructing the roots and rituals of medieval travelers. Historians documented the syncretic blending of Shinto, Buddhism, and folk practices that gave rise to the mountain traditions. Artists painted the peaks in shifting seasonal colors, Fuji in winter silver, Tate in summer green, Haku in autumn gold. Writers composed essays on the mountain's spiritual resonance, finding poetry in the way clouds circled summits like drifting halos. This renewed attention deepened the mountain's connection to both locals and visitors. Schools organized field trips where children learned not only the geography of the peaks, but the stories woven into their slopes. They heard of kami dwelling in waterfalls, of ascetics meditating on cliff edges, of pilgrims who found courage while climbing stone steps that wound upward like an ancient prayer. These lessons cultivated a quiet respect that children carried into adulthood. The modern legacy of Japan's sacred mountains is rooted not in nostalgia, but in continuity. The past is not something to preserve under glass. It is something that breathes, moves, and walks alongside those who step onto the trail today. Every traveler who bows at a shrine, who drinks from a mountain spring, who sits beneath a cedar tree listening to the whisper of wind, participates in a tradition that began long before recorded history. And in the quiet moments, when the sun rises over a ridge, or when mist gathers beneath the canopy, or when the air shifts with the scent of rain, the mountains reveal their enduring truth that the sacred is not lost in modern life. It is simply waiting in places where the world slows down enough for the heart to hear it. As long as the mountains stand, as long as people walk their paths with care, and as long as the stories continue to be told, the legacy of Japan's sacred peaks will remain whole, alive, breathing, and always calling those who seek stillness in a restless age. Night settles over the mountains with a grace that feels older than language, folding the peaks into layers of twilight blue. The last traces of daylight cling to the ridges for a breath, then slip quietly behind them, leaving only the soft shimmer of stars scattered across the sky. In this gentle dark, the sacred mountains seem to exhale, their silhouettes easing into the vast silence that has cradled them for centuries. Far below, the forests hold their own quiet vigil. Cedar trunks rise like pillars, their shadows long and still. Leaves tremble with the slightest motions of night breeze, creating a sound so delicate it feels like the whisper of a distant memory. Streams continue their steady flow, untouched by time, carrying the cool clarity of mountain springs through sleeping valleys. The land, at this hour, feels weightless, as though suspended between the breath of the world and the quiet dreaming of the gods. Along the old pilgrimage paths, the lanterns have all gone dark. Stones worn smooth by 1,000 years of footsteps now rest under the silver glow of moonlight. No travelers pass, no voices drift through the trees, and yet the mountains do not feel empty. They feel full, brimming with the traces of everyone who has ever walked their slopes. Imperial pilgrims, wandering ascetics, modern hikers seeking solace. Their presence lingers like gentle echoes woven into moss and mist. On the higher ridges, where the air grows thin and delicate, a faint wind moves through the grass. It carries with it the scent of earth and pine and distant snow. Here, on these quiet heights, the boundary between the human world and the unseen becomes so soft that even the stars seem closer. Many have stood on these summits at dawn or dusk and felt, for a fleeting moment, that the mountains were listening, holding them in a silence more tender than any spoken prayer. Even now, as midnight deepens and the world grows still, the sacred peaks remain awake. They have watched over centuries of change, yet they do not change in essence. Their presence continues to anchor the land, offering a steady calm to anyone who turns their gaze toward them. They remind the restless heart that stillness is not emptiness, but a kind of quiet fullness. They remind the weary traveler that returning to oneself is as simple as taking a slow breath beneath a canopy of stars. And when dawn eventually rises, spreading pale gold across the mountain crowns, the cycle will begin again. Pilgrims will take their first steps. Forests will glow in new light. Streams will sparkle in motion. But for now, in this moment suspended gently between darkness and dreaming, the mountains rest, ancient, unbroken, and endlessly patient. Here, where the earth meets the sky in a silence shaped by centuries, the sacred peaks hold their vigil, softly, quietly, waiting for the next soul who comes seeking peace in the high places where the kami breathe. Some peaks cut through clouds not with height, but with the weight of centuries carried in silence. Climb a little farther, listen a little deeper, and you may hear the kami dreaming beneath your feet,